can freedom survive the narratives? And he's talking, of course, about America and the West. But what's going on in Gaza, the fighting in Gaza between the Israelis and Palestinians, Hamas-induced, Hamas terrorist attack and a Israeli response, is a good example of this, too, because remarkable is the reporting on this, but it's the same reporting that it's always been on the Middle East, where the D.C. press corps takes the side of terrorist organizations and expresses great skepticism about our one reliable ally in the Middle East, that would be the State of Israel, particularly when it's in the hands of a prime minister like Bibi Netanyahu, of course, who's more conservative than they are, obviously. But I'll tell you what, it's a case study on freedom and the narrative, in quotation marks, because if Israel ever was pushed to adhere to the narrative of the D.C. press corps in this country, then the state of Israel would be wiped off the map. And thank God they know that. I wish more Americans understood it. The big news over the weekend was the tower that contained the hallowed office of the Associated Press was taken down. But
Al Jazeera was in there, too.
And Associated Press's boss, Greg Pruitt, confirmed that they got the heads up from the Israeli military before the strike was launched.
Yes, they are. We had 12 people in the building. We had 1 hour notice. They grabbed all the equipment they could and got out. And fortunately, they are all safe tonight.
Gary Pruitt is his name. I think I said Greg. Anyway, so that's what happened. And Bibi Netanyahu was on Face the Nation this weekend, and he was trying to explain to John Dickerson, and that takes some doing, what's actually happening versus how the D.C. is reporting what's happening.
And frankly, if Hamas thought that they could just fire on our rockets and then sit back and enjoy immunity, that's false. We are targeting a terrorist organization that is targeting our civilians and hiding behind their civilians, using them as human shields. We're doing everything we can to hit the terrorists themselves, their rockets, their rocket caches, and their arms, but we're not going to just let them get away with it. Neither would you. I mean, you just imagine what would have happened if you had 2,900 rockets fired on Washington and New York and others. I think you would understand our position. I think you do, actually.
And he went on that topic a bit more. He developed that a bit more, including explaining what happened with the strike on the building that housed AP and Al Jazeera.
Well, we share with our American friends all that intelligence, and here's the intelligence we had. It's about Palestinian terrorist, an intelligence office for the Palestinian terrorist organization housed in that building that plots and organizes the terror attacks against Israeli civilians. So it's a perfectly legitimate target. And I can tell you that we took every precaution to make sure that there were no civilian injuries, in fact, no deaths, no injuries whatsoever. I can't say injuries. I don't know if somebody received a fragment of a stone. I don't know that. But no people were killed. Now imagine, ask yourself, how is that possible? You see these high-rise towers that are used by Hamas over and over again. They collapse and no one is killed. Why does that happen? Because we, unlike Hamas, take special precautions to tell people, leave the building, leave the premises. We make sure that everyone is gone before we bring down those terrorist facilities. And that's the difference between Israel and Hamas. They deliberately target our cities, deliberately target our civilians. They glorify the death of children and civilians and old people. They are happy with it. I think they're happy with any deaths that are caused to them. You know, all the journalists, one of the, I think, AP journalists said, we were lucky to get out. No, you weren't lucky to get out. It wasn't luck. It's because we took special pains to call people in those buildings to make sure that the premises were vacated.
Which Associated Press boss Gary Pruitt confirmed.
Well, yeah. Sometimes they drop flyers. You have such and such time to get out.
And on the condemnation by the international community, whatever the hell that is, one of those phrases that pseudo-intellectuals like to throw around. the international community, and that would, of course, include the Socialist Spice Girls in the House Democrat Socialist Caucus here, the likes of Rashida Tlaib and ex officio members of that band like Bolshevik Bernie. What does Bibi think about the condemnation?
When the international community attacks Israel, they're actually encouraging Hamas to continue these attacks because Hamas says it's great. We're both killing Israeli civilians, and unfortunately, some of ours, and they're happy with their own civilian casualties because it gets the international community to focus their attacks on Israel instead of Hamas. That's wrong. Sure. It's both wrong and unproductive because actually what it does is prolong the conflict and escalate and increase the number of casualties that happen as a result of the continuation of the conflict.
Mm-hmm. So that's what's happening from the perspective of the Israeli prime minister. Here's what's happening from the perspective of Bernie Sanders.
The Israeli government has evolved over the years into a pretty strong right-wing government, and their coalition now includes people who are overt racists.
Of course. Cry racism. Then you don't have to have a discussion on the merits or provide much in the way of detail. For more on all this, we're pleased to be joined for our weekly conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and author of the soon-to-be-released Brutal War, Jungle Fighting in Papua New Guinea, 1942. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Jim.
Hey, good to be with you.
So Bernie Sanders, it's a right-wing government that's racist, and apparently that's the source of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and Hamas specifically.
Hamas and the Islamic Jihad are terrorist groups. They're actually identified as terrorist groups. They're wildly anti-Semitic. They're tools of Iran. They started this war, and I really find it impossible that any organization or individual or public official could identify with them and really escape the criticism that you're abetting anti-Semitism, genocide, and terrorism. Because all those things are just factually true.
Well, yeah. I suppose we're here in this place routinely, although it seemed to be going the other direction under the previous administration, and that was helpful. And again, as I sort of said at the outset, the D.C. press corps narrative and the narrative of socialists like Bernie Sanders never changes. The antipathy towards Israel from the left in this country, whether it's the media or the Democrat Party, never ceases to amaze.
Look, I mean, it is a very predictable narrative. It's give me a story that allows me to claim that I'm a warm, cuddly person that's wrapping somebody in a blanket. And it doesn't matter what horrors or evil are perpetrated under that name, because I have a narrative that gives me cover. And as long as that narrative lines up with my ability to destroy power structures and enemies I don't like, and accumulates a power and authority to me, that's fine. So people shouldn't be surprised that the same people that would march in the streets and cheer on Hamas and Islamic Jihad are the same people that support BLM and Antifa, and that they're actually rooted in common extremist ideologies that are anti-freedom, anti-democratic, don't believe in human rights. I mean, it's you look at the company that you keep, and the company that you keep is authoritarian, anti-democratic, and wildly anti-Semitic and racist.
It's perfectly tailored, right? People of color being oppressed, whether it's in East Jerusalem or a big city America. That's the story all the time.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a big problem for the president. I mean, this is a coalition party that he rules that is made up with people that are all over the place, much more diverse than the other side, and not diverse in a good way. I mean, there are people in the president's party that believe that the Middle East would be better off if it was run by the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a incredibly radical extremist organization, which philosophically takes its roots from Nazi Germany, which is so. I mean, BLM and Antifa are fundamentally Maoist. I mean, they draw their beliefs from radical authoritarian ideologies, and looking at somehow as that these are the forces of good in the world. No good can ever come of this, and this really, I think, does put the president's party at odds against itself. I mean, Israel is our most critical and crucial ally in the Middle East. It's also the key to unlocking peace and prosperity in the Middle East, as we saw with the normalization of relations between the Arabs and Israel. It's the future of the region. Not to mention, these are people that deserve to have a life here, and you are siding with the other side. Remember, why is Hamas doing this? They know they can't win this war. They know they can't actually destroy Israel. They're only doing this for one purpose. There has to be dead Palestinian children bleeding out in the street. They have to have that because that justifies the struggle, much in the way the IRA could not tolerate a Catholic and a Protestant sitting at a table together and would kill them just to demonstrate that peace was intolerable. Islamic Jihad and Hamas have to demonstrate that peace is intolerable, and the only way they can do that is by death. And it doesn't matter whose death or misery it is. It doesn't matter if it's the enemy or your own people, because it's the struggle that gives you the right to exist. And if the struggle goes away, then all of a sudden your corruption, your murder, your power, your millions of dollars, your control over everything, that doesn't matter anymore.
Well, what is President Biden and his administration doing to try and get a ceasefire? Besides talking on the phone to both leaders.
Yeah, essentially they got in the Wayback Machine with Mr. Peabody and went back to the last decade and have this unshakable belief that there can only be peace in the Middle East unless there's a peace deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and that the United States can only broker peace if it is a truly neutral party and looks at both sides completely equal. It doesn't matter if one's a terrorist group that is murdering innocent children and one's just defending itself. That's a failed formula that has failed forever, and reflexively going back and reinstituting that formula isn't going to do any better. And here's the problem. It's not just that they're reinstituting a diplomatic foreign policy that we know won't work because it's demonstrably proven to fail over and over again. There are actually people in the president's party cheering on for it to fail. They don't want a two-state solution either. They want the Israelis thrown into the sea. There are people in the president's party who believe that Israel does not have a right to exist. And they're actually willing to criticize their own president for even the milquetoast approach that he's taken by just saying that Israel has a right to defend itself. I think this is a party that's going to tear itself apart if the longer this war goes on.
It's something too just about this that's instructive. It's useful as a case study. Boy, Hamas, terrorist organization, as you said, so designated by our State Department, including the State Department under this president, they really know how to give the D.C. press corps what it needs to run with their angle on this fighting. They've set this up as this is about eviction proceedings in Sheikh Jarrah, when nothing of the sort is true. But I mean, it's the perfect way to domesticate the issue for Democrat socialists in big cities. Forbearance on this, and here in Cook County, the sheriff's not going to evict anybody. So, because that's a human rights issue, the right to have a home, and the bad Israeli government is evicting people. First of all, it's not happening. Secondly, the matter is really a land dispute between private parties. But regardless, that's the easy way for them to sell it locally to their constituents.
Right, but this is a press corps that's been conditioned by how they've been told to respond to BLM and Antifa and other radical aspects of a progressive agenda. It's wrap it in a warm blanket and then ignore the evil part of this. And again, even like the AP. I mean, why did you have offices in a building that has the military office of a terrorist organization. Why did you think that was a good idea?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're comfortable there. I wanted to get your reaction to one other matter unrelated to this. This Space Force commander that was fired, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeyer, he was on a podcast talking about this book that he's written about Marxism. And he talked about what was going on in the military. He said, since taking command as a commander about 10 months ago, I saw what I consider fundamentally incompatible and competing narratives of what America was, is, and should be. This wasn't just prolific in social media or throughout the country during the past year. It was spreading throughout the U.S. military, and I had recognized those narratives as being Marxist in nature. And he's been, as I said, fired from his post. What's the latitude that a military officer has to write, to comment, or should have? I mean, is that something where, hey, he knew what the risks were and he crossed the line, or is this something that is problematic in terms of military culture from your perspective?
Well, if you are in uniform and you go to public a book, it does have to go through review from the U.S. government. So, and I don't know the specifics of the case. So I don't know, legally what kind of, under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, what he may or may not have, done. So I will speak broadly on this issue, which is the military should not be dragged into essentially what are partisan, cultural, ideological fights. The military only has one culture, and that culture is selfless service to the nation, period. All these other trappings of political agendas, whether it's climate change or gender issues or critical race theory, they're completely inappropriate. We have a long history of people trying to culturally inculcate people in the military. It never ends well. And the reason for that is, culture and politics are kissing cousins. When you start to put a specific spin on this, you start to put a political tinge on that. And if it's anything other than patriotism and selfless service, and everybody in uniform is exactly the same color, gender, and everything else, and all that matters is the uniform, and you're serving in the military, and you're serving your country, and you're serving the Constitution. Anything you layer on top of that gets to be pretty problematic. And what we have here is an administration with an incredibly aggressive partisan agenda, which is rooted in radical ideologies. It's way beyond civics and good governance. It's pure ideological politics. Critical race theory is radical political propaganda, and permitting and encouraging that in the military is absolutely beyond the pale. No administration should do that from any political quarter. So I'm completely sympathetic with his concerns. What his legal obligations are under UCMJ, I don't know, because I haven't looked at the specifics of the case.
Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, VP of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Pick up the book. It's coming out. Brutal War, Jungle Fighting in Papua New Guinea, 1942. Jim, thanks as always.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're talking about it, Dan and Amy are talking about it. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
This is attorney Stephen Leahy. This isn't the first crisis we faced together. Back in '08, business professionals in trouble sought help from bankruptcy attorneys.